I don't want AI being controlled by Beijing or the Bay Area, and I want Japan to kind of have the opportunity to shine. And I think that's a really critical line. It is critical to have control of AI across your stack.
Best case scenario for Japan is like we produce another Toyota or Sony. But at the very least, when there's like a next SpaceX or a next Anduril, like Japan is like embedded in the supply chain and can benefit economically. That's like a huge win for us.
Thank you again for coming tonight. I want to kick this off as quickly as possible and get right to the exciting stuff. So let's just start out with some really brief 2-minute introductions. I'll begin. My name's Tim Romero. I've been in Japan for about 30 years plus. I've started 4 companies here, sold a couple, bankrupted a couple, 50-50, not too bad as far as startups
That's
go.
better than VC odds.
I've helped both TEPCO and Jira spin up their CVC units. I ran Google for Startups for about 4 years. And I've been running a podcast called Disrupting Japan for about 11, 12 years now, which is my labor of love. So please give it a listen, like and subscribe and all of that stuff.
I'm Grace Isford, partner at Lux Capital. We're a deep tech and frontier tech fund based in the US between New York and San Francisco. And we invest at the intersection of technology and science. So that'll be cutting edge tech in, AI. We were actually early investors in the AI ecosystem. Our first investment was in 2013 and have since partnered with companies like Cognition, which is an AI software engineer, Together AI, which is an AI cloud, and of course, Sakana AI. And I know we have some of the founders in the room tonight, which is, state-of-the-art research lab in Tokyo, Japan. We were also really early to hard tech and industrial investing. So we actually led the seed round of Anduril back in 2017. That's a US kind of next-gen defense prime. That was when defense was pretty contrarian, and we invested before it was cool, and have since invested in a lot of hardware and manufacturing companies like Hadrian, and also physical intelligence and robotics. What's cool kind of coming to this event is back when we invested in Sakana in 2023, we were founding investors there. Japan was up on the rise, but I don't think investing in Japan and startups there was as consensus, right? And since then, we've seen this amazing growth of the ecosystem, growth of corporates investing, growth of great VCs like Coral and others, and growth of a fantastic ecosystem of funds and others like JIC who are kind of helping grow the ecosystem here. So we're really excited to be here. And then my fun fact, which I think also I share with James, is that I lived in Japan for part of my childhood in Hiro. And so it's particularly cool to be here again with all of you.
So I'm James Riney, founder and CEO of Coral Capital. And I've been investing in Japan before it was cool. So basically my background is American passport. I spent most of my childhood in Japan. So I was in Japan until I was 12 years old. Went to the US, graduated from US University, came straight back to Japan, started out in investment banking, hated it, ended up starting a company. In that company, we started doing lots of different things in the beginning, but it eventually became CoinCheck, which is one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges in Japan. And I left kind of midway. I was thinking about doing something else. I thought maybe if I go to the investor side, it'd be a good place to kind of prepare my next attack. And through a chain of events, ended up launching our first fund with a US firm. Had done pretty well in that fund, invested in Smart HR. We announced last year that we exited a big portion of our position in that company. And thanks to that exit to General Electric, we were able to 6x our fund. And in 2019, we branched off as Coral Capital. And we had been investing in sort of like this deep tech space for a while, like literally since their first fund in 2016, we did that. And one example of one of those companies is a company called Gitai, which is a space robot company. And it's basically comprised of some of the best roboticists in Japan. If you guys remember, there was a bipedal robot that would go viral on social media at that time. And it was made by a company called Shaft, and that company was sold to Google. A lot of those roboticists basically branched out, went to a few different companies, but one of those companies was Gitai, and we funded them. And they've made a lot of progress in the US, and they just secured a very big contract that I can't announce yet, but it's very big, and I'm very excited to announce that soon. We've also done like fusion, fission, diamond semiconductors, all kinds of like cool frontier shit. So these are areas that we think that Japan has a fundamental advantage from a global perspective. We've done software domestically, but frankly, we don't think software is the place for Japanese companies to go global. We think it's actually in the hard spaces, in manufacturing, in aerospace, in energy, so on and so forth. And we can talk about why that is. But personally, I'm very excited about this like U.S.-Japan partnership. And I think the partnership between the United States and Japan is the strongest that it's ever been. And in the face of rising global powers that are not necessarily thinking about us and have our best interests at heart, I think it's critically important that we think about partnerships and how we advance our technologies and our industrial bases, to counter those forces.
Fantastic. And those partnerships are a theme I definitely want to return to before we finish up tonight. But first, I mean, we all are bullish on Japan. We've invested in Japan. A lot of us have started companies here. But let's start by saying the quiet part out loud. Most people see Japan as lagging in startup innovation and innovation in general. And that's not without substance. So where is Japan leading? What is the concrete areas where we can say, this is something Japan does well. This is something Japan can teach the rest of the world. James?
Well, first of all, I will start by disagreeing with you.
All right, excellent.
To make it interesting. So one thing I will give you is that from a startup perspective, we have a long way to go. So just to give context, when I started my company, there was less than $1 billion invested in startups in Japan. And I was, I had a 300K seed round, and it was like, that was impressive. It was very, very hard. And since then, like we're roughly around like 7 to 10 billion, something like that. So like it's come a long way. And we've had, single digit $1 billion outcomes fairly consistently now. But what we're still missing is like the $10 billion plus outcomes. Like where are like the next Toyotas, the next Sonys? That I will give you. We have a long ways to go. And we at Coral Capital think that it's going to be in these areas that we talked about, right? Japan has already proven in some of these areas that we can discuss that they can thrive globally. And in fact, they have, of course, during like Japan's so-called like heyday. But just because you don't see like the Japanese brands like front and center, your phone is no longer, a Japanese brand. It's a American brand, or Apple, for example.
I want to make sure we don't brush over what those areas are.
Well, yeah. So I'll get into that. So like basically like, like Japan basically retreated into like the supply chain, right? So, of course, like, you when you talk about like the devices that are in your hand, that's one area. And then gradually over time, it's like, the components that go into those devices, particularly like in semiconductor space, like Japan had dominance, like global dominance. It was like 90% market share in the early 90s. And then of course, like, they got disrupted by TSMC, and the market changed from not being fully integrated, but actually having design and fab separated, and we can talk about that. But there are specific areas of the supply chain with regards to, for example, like semiconductors, where Japan actually stayed as an oligopoly. So like in the photoresist market, 90% plus, silicon wafers, 50% plus, so on and so forth. And that trend you can see in many other parts of the global supply chain for like robotics, aerospace, defense now, so on and so forth. And so like Japan has been innovating, actually, like innovating, like out innovating pretty much everyone, right? Clearly they have, because there's an oligopoly in like many of these markets. So I would not say that Japan has not innovated. They definitely have. It's just that they're not as visible as they used to be, and so they're not top of mind.
So would it be fair to say, rather than looking at it as dominating a particular area like AI or SaaS software, it is dominating very specific, very lucrative niches in a lot of different fields?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent.
Great.
Can I just like pull a thread on that? I read, one of James's posts, and I think one of the words you used, and I'm going to practice my Japanese, is Monozukuri, right, or craftsmanship. And I think that really stands out when I think about Japan and where Japan thrives at that hardware or material and process intersection. So whether it's semiconductors and photoresist, or whether it's robotics, right? And I think robotics is a really interesting theme where Japan was way ahead of the game on humanoid robotics, and robotics are already here and part of the population, and will probably play a huge role in the light of demographic changes in Japan going forward. We're really excited about defense and kind of the growth in spending from 1 to 2% of GDP by the government, and what that means for both startups and also, contracts with potential companies in the portfolio. Just a few other things to touch on, though. Zooming out from, actual sector that I've seen, as a US investor, where we invest in a lot of different global markets coming to Japan, the role of the government is really interesting, right? Whether it's the Medi grants, whether it's the 5-year startup program, where there's an active interest in growing startups, 10 trillion yen committed by 2027 to invest, compute grants, which makes it a lot more feasible to get AI startups up and running. The corporate partnerships, I don't see 400 plus different corporations investing in startups in the same way they do in Japan. And that comes also with money, right? And so I read that there was over a decade, shift. We've seen a huge amount of corporate funding from, 40 mil over a decade ago to multiple billions now. And we've seen that firsthand with Sakana, right? Where they've actually benefited from working with these corporates on their cap table, forging commercial partnerships, and also benefiting from working hand in hand with the government. Last thing I'll say, and this is more a geopolitical thing, U.S.-China relations are in, a pretty interesting position right now, and Japan remains a really critical democratic U.S. ally, and Japan should lean into that, right? There is a really unique reason why that matters for supply chain, and if I'm coming to manufacture in Japan for a specific component or a specific motor or a specific AI model or talent, Japan has a unique opportunity to lean into that.
Okay, this is just an observation, but it does seem like the past, let's say, 3 decades in the US, in Japan, and probably some other markets, but certainly not China, that the startup technology world and the world of politics were basically separate. So, like, the technologists kind of just did their own thing and were not really that interested in government. And then the government folks were kind of doing their own thing. And there wasn't a whole lot of cross-pollination. But if you look at like the history of civilizations, you cannot dislocate or disassociate technology and geopolitics. Like they're one and the same. They're like, AI now, like we're seeing how important it is to geopolitics. Semiconductors, same thing. And it just seems like we've like snapped out of this like trance for these like past 30 years, where actually like what we're doing is like super important to geopolitics. And the reason I mention that is because like, what Grace was saying, the importance of like government backing cannot be underscored enough. So it's only until recently that the Japanese government has been providing like government subsidies for these like deep tech endeavors. And so, for example, like Coral is a Japanese government certified VC. What that means is that when we fund some of these companies, they can go on and raise tens of millions of dollars in government grants to set up facilities, for example. So it de-risks those investments. If you look at what like China and Korea did over the past like 20 to 30 years, that's exactly what happened, basically. Like a lot of the industries were subsidized by the government. And so that's why like Japan actually had to like escape or escape a lot of those critical industries where like they could not play like a volume game anymore. Like they just had to move up the stack where like process power was the thing that made it much harder to replicate. So like the metallurgy, the thermodynamics, like so on and so forth. There's so many things that go into some of these, like, creating these substrates that it's just like, it's not as easy as just like reverse engineering it once you have the product.
No, I think your point on technology and government policy driving each other is something that is underappreciated. In the US, certainly in the last few years, we've seen the technology industry assert itself politically much stronger than it has in the past. But a lot of people don't appreciate that even Silicon Valley is based largely on defense spending and DARPA investment. And it's something that's been downplayed in the past decades. But historically speaking, military spending and military necessity has always been a huge driver of innovation globally for centuries. But Grace, I do want to follow up with one question. You highlighted some really interesting and important differences about how governments and corporates work with startups in Japan. In your view, are these something that are just simply different and interesting and addressing different needs? Or do you think there's something that Japan could learn from the US system or that should be adjusted that could help propel things forward a bit faster?
I think a key issue has been like later stage capital and also later stage expertise, right? I think we hope that there's more smart HRs. We have high hopes for Sakana, of course, on their ability to kind of regenerate and create new talent who has seen scale and seen what good looks like, ideally on a global stage. I think that is like a real missing piece on multiple fronts. One, on the funding. Two, on the actual expertise and talent, particularly on the commercial side. Fantastic technical talent here. Where we often see the gap is that commercial talent and that global awareness of what that good looks like.
Excellent. Let's talk about partnerships. James, I think your point is well taken. Japan dominates a lot of really critical niches in certainly in manufacturing across a lot of different industries. Now, any one company being part of a global supply chain, being an essential part of a global supply chain is a great place to be. But in terms of the health of the startup ecosystem in general, do you think this supply chain first strategy is enough to really drive the ecosystem forward? Or do you think that companies in general need to own the product to drive innovation, to push their own vision towards their own customers?
I think it's both. Yeah. I mean, if there are startups that are focused on specific choke points within the supply chain, that's great. And actually, like, you're already seeing this sort of like reindustrialize America, like American dynamism stuff. Like, there are a lot of companies that are actually just focusing on like pretty standard stuff. Like they're like making actuators in the US, and like they're going to supply actuators to these robotics companies in the US and allies, right? So I think that can be the case in Japan as well. So like one of our companies, for example, is Okuma Diamond, and they're building diamond semiconductors that can be used in like power plants, satellites, and also in defense. But like there's going to be other ones that focus like going directly to the customer. Now, with that said, like, who is the customer? Like, is it going to be consumer? I hope so. Like, I hope we get back to like another Sony. That'd be great. But we've also invested in companies that are like literally building fission power plants. So it's a very different customer set. It's not necessarily like the Japan that you think of when you think of like the peak in the 80s.
Okay.
I really like the idea of Japan continuing to lean into this idea of interconnected supply chain, right? Back to the earlier ideas we talked about is the importance of that US and Western kind of strategic ally. Japan can be that unique kind of monopoly for a few specific components and go deep with some of these kind of partnerships with US or Western companies. Anduril, the company I mentioned earlier, our US kind of next-gen defense prime, they specifically partnered with a Japanese motor company called Aster. It was publicly announced a few weeks ago. And the really exciting thing about that is Japan is now kind of the industrial point of record for Anduril, where they're going really deep. They're going to produce their whole kind of motor supply chain here, and they're going to invest in capital and resources. And that's going to, of course, benefit Astra, the motor company, but I think it has wider ramifications for the Japanese economy on actually showing kind of what good looks like in kind of the defense and industrial supply chain. Another great example is Applied Intuition in our portfolio. They are a company based in the Bay Area doing software for autonomous vehicles. They have a great partnership with Isuzu, and they are working with Isuzu to create autonomous trucks. And what they're doing with them is implementing their software. It's a win-win for both Applied and Isuzu. And it's another great example of the US-Japan partnership, right? Where you're taking advantage of a component or a company that may only exist in Japan or may be uniquely good or well-suited to the supply chain in Japan and working kind of on a global stage.
But I really love the Anduril example because, to be honest with you, I hadn't fully internalized how much Anduril supply chain was dependent on Japan. And it really hit home when I was at the launch event in December. And is a room full of Japanese corporates, and like, of course, like, you mingle and like, hey, like, why are you here? Like, oh no, we supply this and that. And it's like, okay, like the Sentry towers in Anduril, like they're Toshiba batteries, and like, the Kizuna drone that they just announced at the event, it's 100% sourced from Japan. And so like, on the one hand, it's like, I feel like pride. Like, of course, like, I'm American passport, but I've been in Japan longer than anywhere else. I really want Japan to win. And it's just so nice to see that that's happening. Best case scenario for Japan is like we produce another Toyota or Sony. Like that's really what, like, priority number one. But at the very least, when there's like a next SpaceX or a next Anduril, like Japan is like embedded in the supply chain and can benefit economically. That's like a huge win for us.
What about, let's talk a bit about defense in particular, because I think right now we live in interesting times, in the Chinese curse sense of interesting times. The kind of world order that has been the mainstay for the last 80 years is changing. And both Anduril in the US and Helsing in Europe are, defense industry is going to get a lot more fragmented. Do you see Japan as sort of this trusted, fairly neutral supplier of these key components for, well, just about everybody, basically?
I mean, I could take that. It's a critical need for any of our US companies that are selling into DoD, US Department of Defense, that all their components are tracked on where they're coming from, right? And so the true reshoring of the US supply chain matters. The fact of the matter is, though, that a lot of these critical components we cannot produce at either the scale or the quality in the US. And so there's a huge problem. And yes, we are reindustrializing many pieces and components, but there are certain pieces like motors that we are going to have a really hard time getting to the caliber or scale that you could, for example, in Japan. And so I think there's going to be a natural partnership that's only going to continue to get more important. And I think there's a lot of kind of tertiary benefits if Japan is the number one choice for a lot of these companies and partnerships. Traditionally in our companies, we see a lot of components from both Japan, but also Germany. And those being kind of critical chokeholds in some point of these kind of companies where it's really critical to get through the stack.
And one of the reasons that defense, aerospace, robotics, depending on certain segments, is a good fit for Japan, or rather Japan is a good fit for those industries, is because it's not just about like how cheap it is. Like if you are like entering orbit at like Mach 25, like you don't want your spaceship to like just like shatter.
You don't want to go for the low cost run.
Yeah, exactly. Like don't go like buy Japan. Like you definitely want those components to be made in Japan, right? so like like those industries in particular, like it's a great starting point. And if it scales up and we can address like other parts of the market, great. But like defense and aerospace, like now that we're seeing this like renaissance in the US, I think it's a great place for Japan to play.
And just to extend it one step further, because of course Lux has a lot of AI investing too, is all the data and exhaust you're getting from these physical systems is really interesting, right? Whether it's all the data you're collecting from physical AI deployments of robotics, whether it's the data you're collecting in a warehouse, whether it's the sensor data in your manufacturing or logistics startup or company, that is all getting collected by Japanese companies in this case. And there's going to be unique opportunities to either supply that data or create AI applications with that data. And so we're really excited to kind of see that. It might take time as we scale up, but I think that's a necessary kind of second order effect we'll see in the coming years.
So in the same way that we've been seeing a lot of different countries or regions kind of rethink and secure their supply chains. So right now in AI, the foundation models are dominated by US and China. Do you think we're going to see national foundation models in the sense that each country or each, like the EU, like Japan, wants to have its own national foundation model that they control? Do you see this happening as well?
I think it is likely that it will happen. I don't know where, and I don't necessarily think it's democratic. And so there's a whole other conversation that we could probably spend another hour talking about.
We'll do that next time.
But with, I remember very distinctly when we invested in Sakana AI, David Haw, the founder and CEO, I think I see back in the room there, had a great quote and saying, I think he tweeted it too, which was, I don't want AI being controlled by Beijing or the Bay Area, and I want Japan to have the opportunity to shine. And I think that's a really critical critical line. And he said that, way before I think it was cool. But sovereign AI and AI is a national asset. It is critical to have control of AI across your stack. It's critical for every country, every company, every individual to have control of their AI systems. And in Japan, it's critical to have our own, sovereign AI strategy and approach. Obviously, we are putting our chips behind Sakana and the potential for them to be that kind of winner. I do think there is a lot of really interesting opportunities, though, on the application layer in Japan. And for Japan to continue to build, to continue to make sure the open source models they're using are safe, they're not, have any post-training negative effects from either China or the US, and their potential to truly be national and Japanese for Japanese applications, for Japanese culture, for Japanese language. I think we're pretty early in seeing kind of the opportunity on the user experience and workflow side there.
Fantastic. Final thoughts before we open it up to questions. So partnerships is a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic theme. We've talked about a bit about AI, about the defense opportunities. Couple of bullet points. Where else do you see great opportunities for partnerships between Japanese startups and foreign startups, foreign investors, foreign corporates for this supply chain strategy?
Well, I mean, so like one that I feel very strongly about, and it's perhaps controversial depending on who you are, is nuclear energy. So, yeah, I mean, like if you look at the history of Japan, so in 1941, the U.S. oil embargo basically shut off all oil to Japan. Japan was importing 90% of their oil at the time, so it was catastrophic. Obviously, that led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entering World War II. Now, politics aside, like whether that was justified or not, that's not what I'm trying to talk about. But I'm just saying, like 90% in one country, like let's just talk like strategically, like that doesn't sound like a good bet. And then in 1970s, same thing with the oil crisis in the Middle East, and Japan was importing from the Middle East majority of their oil, and then you had like 25% inflation. Prices went up like 4x, and it was very painful. And so what that did is it set Japan on a track to focus on nuclear energy, so that Japan could have energy security, which I think any country should aim for, right? You should not be dependent on any one country for your energy supply. So fast forward, Japan increased the energy mix to 30% for nuclear energy. And then, I mean, basically at that time, like they were thinking about going to France level, like over 50%, right? Which I think they should have continued. But then you had the earthquake, obviously. Everything went just completely shut down. You went to like 0%, okay? Well, turns out like that growth in the nuclear industry also led to Japan being a critical player within the nuclear industry when it comes to all these factors that go in. So like, if you're talking about enriching uranium, you're talking about the pumps. If you're talking about building the reactor itself, like Japan Steelworks owns like 80-90% of the market for building these, these reactors. And there's like many examples like that. So what did METI do? So METI, in order to protect the Japanese industry, they published a PDF. You can actually look this up. They published a PDF of all the Japanese suppliers within the nuclear supply chain, so that global players could order from them, and that know-how that those businesses would stay in business for this like hibernation period for nuclear. Now what's happening? So like we're at 8-9%. There's like restart programs, and by 2030 they're going to increase it to 20%. I would argue that's actually not enough, right? Like we just had an issue in Iran, right? Well, guess what? 70% of the oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So we're just like Japan keeps like, it's like deja vu. Like we keep doing this to ourselves. Like, what are we doing? So I personally think that like nuclear energy is really important, and Japan is already a great supplier for like American nuclear power. Might as well build it at home.
Excellent. Right? Okay. I want to thank our panelists here and open this up to questions.
Hey, Tim. Actually, I got a question for Tim. Actually, I'm from David Huff, Sakana AI. Actually, I've been listening to your podcast since you started 13 years.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Inspirations for me to start a company.
Oh my God. Thank you so much.
I think it's a really inspiring talk. I think there's debate about creating the next Sony, but at the same time, from an investor's angle, it might actually be good enough to actually invest in companies that have a stranglehold in a certain niche, like in supply chain, in this like defense. But in your view, for Japan to really take off, is that enough, or do you think Japan needs another Sony in the world? I want to hear from you.
Well, I think that as an investor, it doesn't matter. As an investor, it doesn't matter. But as an ecosystem, as a country, if you look at Japan's success in the 50s and 60s, if you look at China's success over the last 25 years, it has been specifically moving away from being the world supply chain and into owning the product and owning the customers and driving innovation. So in my opinion, yeah, we need that. That's going to be essential to the long-term health of the Japanese economy.
What areas do you think Japan can do in order to be the next global champion in this sort of?
Actually, I'm in very much agreement with James and Grace on this one in terms of the areas.
Well, let's be clear, like what we mean by like next Sony or Toyota. Like it's more symbolic of like scale, right? So it doesn't mean that we're going to make another Sony. Like obviously, like we're it's a different world, right? So like there's other things that we need. Japan is dominant in like many critical industries, but like I think that there are also like startup opportunities that leverage that foundation. So the anecdote that I'll point to is like, okay, Anduril sourced 100% of their Kizuna drone from Japan. Why did a Japanese company not just do that? Like, why didn't the Japanese company just use the domestic supply chain to create a drone company in Japan? Like, it doesn't make so this is what we need to solve for is like, we need to find, smart people and inspire them to take risks and aim bigger. And I think that now that things are actually changing in Japan, you have this like external pressure. Like in Japan, obviously, kuropune is like the thing that's talked about a lot. But because we're probably on the downtrend of Pax Americana, Japan has to stand up for itself. And I think that's basically the sort of tip of the iceberg for a lot of these things that happen. So if you look at the history of Japan, like when did change happen rapidly? Perry ships came into the bay, and then within like a few decades, you had like this huge industrial revolution, and obviously that led to the Meiji Restoration. And so Japan moved very, very quickly. There were startups, all over that were focusing on industrializing Japan. And then same thing happened after World War II. Like the Americans, when they came to Japan after World War II for the occupation, they could not believe how devastated Tokyo was. Like it was like completely like they knew it was bad, but they didn't realize how bad it was, right? From those assets, Japan within decades become another like major industrial power. So clearly it can be done. It's just a matter of like mindset, ambition, and whether like the pressure is there for Japanese to rise. And I think we're getting to the end of this sort of like shogunai period. In Japan is making moves to change things. And Takaichi, I think she is symbolic of that change. So I'm excited about it.
And I think another point is something that both Grace and James brought up is the need for capital. It takes a lot more capital to own the entire product than it does to be part of the supply chain.
And I think just last thing I'd add is I think there are some structural issues generally creating a ton of new Sonys today in the Japanese ecosystem, right? I do think it takes either a global awareness or a global team to be able to almost see through some of the structural issues, right? Obviously, you made the choice to raise from US VCs for first capital in, right? Which we're very happy about. But I do think for, first check in, if you have an environment that encourages companies to go public at a much smaller scale, it encourages, at multiple levels down, companies to think smaller, right? And if they only know startups that their friends have started that have only made it to a very small amount of revenue, that's not very inspiring. So I do think more examples of what good looks like and, aspiring for the next Sony while also, being really excited for, these really meaningful, large kind of supply chain companies is great too.
Thank you so much for your fantastic talk. And yeah, as you know, Japanese government distributes so much grant to deep tech startup coming out from university, right? So as an individual, I really appreciate your support because I guess some of them. But as an ecosystem, they distribute even startup that don't have so much customer near future. I mean, they focus on technology development too much and they don't know where they can find the customer actually. I guess US may have same problem, but Japanese problem might be more serious because government distributes so much grant they can survive anyway. Before they find the customer. So I just want to know, how US venture capital tell entrepreneurs or researchers not to see technology too much. Like how do they say customer is important to researchers in deep tech?
Yeah, I can take it. I do think providing capital and letting people experiment and try even before they may even have, a really strong idea is a great thing, right? Whether that's an accelerator or any sort of program, government program and beyond. So I am a fan. I think there's someone from Jetro in the room. I think that's a cool accelerator too. I do think the government has to use discretion, right, to the extent they can, and that's not always possible or easy. So public-private partnerships and VC partnerships or governments working closely with VCs can be one way to try to create kind of a bit more taste in where companies are getting funded. At least in the US, like it's largely independent and private, right? And so it's just like there's a robust enough VC ecosystem that that's not the case, where it's pretty easy to raise funds if you're in the US. And so I think it's a lot about creating the activation energy. And I would assume, hopefully if we're successful and, with the 5-year plan and more startups being created, where there'll be, a bit more gating factors. And already today, I'd argue there are natural gating factors in the ecosystem of, yes, you could get government funding, but can you get to like the next level? I do think there's different levels of government funding too, in terms of the scale, right? Relative to, more nominal amounts of compute.
Thanks guys for the great talk. I think there's a number of mentions of making the next Sony, right? How can we have something for our economic future in Japan? And then I think a number of kind of comments around the bottlenecks around that, right? How do we have global teams from day one that can raise from US investors? I think the majority of people in Japan, as talented as they may be, may not have that experience, right? And I think both of you spent time growing up in Japan. And so I'm kind of curious both from kind of the education element, but also where do you see the bottlenecks? Because we haven't had somebody make a decacorn or $10 billion business in a generation. And so there aren't the role models to follow domestically. And so, maybe the Babel fish will come out and language won't be a barrier, but culture still will be. And do you just only bet on international teams, or how can you leverage the strengths of the domestic talent that is here in a way to get there faster?
I think it's two things. I think one is just more global awareness. And so exchange programs, getting members of companies, teams to either spend time in the US, study in the US, find ways of, just more integration between, whether US or other international markets in Japan. So there's just more people in Japan who have spent time working or seeing a US startup ecosystem. The other, I think, is James and I have chatted in the past about, and I think you've written about this too, is like irrational pessimism that often is in the Japanese market, where there's like almost like this risk off mindset. And, the whole game of startups and venture capital is about risk. And so finding a way to kind of like inculcate kind of the belief and values of, risk on. And that's, I think, a deeper, more difficult cultural thing to instill. And I think it does help by either having programs that are, small amounts of capital to get you started, to kind of lower the friction or kind of kinetic energy needed to kind of get that startup, get that first funding, and also, believe that, take that risk, try that startup. Like the worst case is you're a second-time founder, and there's like, a very good landing pad, even if that company isn't successful.
I think exposure and integration is a great answer. That's definitely part of it. And I'll give you just like an example domestically. So we invest anywhere in Japan. Like we get contacted by entrepreneurs all over Japan, and just our observation. But like the companies that we have seen that choose to stay outside of Tokyo, they just don't move as fast. They don't move as fast because they don't realize how quickly everyone else in Tokyo is moving. And so like having more exposure to global stakeholders, whether that be like entrepreneurs or investors, I think is important. Like I think that like there's too many like unknowns. So that's definitely a factor. And then, like something that we've been thinking about a lot, because obviously we're funding a lot of these Japanese companies that have global aspirations, is at least at the management team level, there needs to be like a certain level of like English proficiency, and then also like balls, so like some Japanese can speak English like okay, but like more importantly is like whether they have the confidence to pitch in English. And like we'll take the bet that if they have that chutzpah, that over time they will develop and learn how to pitch. But I think that there's too little of that. So we like to see that. And then the other thing is like, how do you compartmentalize some of the functions so that like, Japan has like great engineering talent, but like, unfortunately, in some cases, like it's really hard to integrate with them with like global engineering talent. And that might not necessarily be insurmountable in the sense that like, maybe this particular part of the business, like you just compartmentalize and it's just a bunch of really cracked, amazing Japanese engineers. But like at the management layer, you're coordinating a global business, right? So I think there's many approaches to building it. And at least historically, Japanese companies have been able to manage those things. So I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to do it again.
I know there's a lot more questions. I've got a lot more questions. So let's give a big hand for our panel and finish up with the questions over networking. And thank you, everyone.